This movie is entitled Motor Systems 1, where we consider the spinal cord and the descending motor pathways. The motor system is composed of three major components. The first are the motor neurons in the spinal cord that send their axons to the periphery to directly innervate muscle fibers. Motor neurons are also known as the final common pathway. The second are the descending pathways that originate from the various parts of the brain and send their axons down the brain as fiber tracts to innervate and thereby influence the activity of the motor neurons. And finally, the third component is the cerebellum and basal ganglia. These structures do not themselves send fiber tracts to innervate the motor neurons. Rather, their axons innervate the cells that give rise to the descending fiber tracts and thereby affect the activity of the descending fiber tracts and indirectly influence the activity of motor neurons. Here we consider features of motor neurons and the origins of the various motor pathways or tracts that innervate the motor neurons in the spinal cord. In subsequent movies, we will consider the basal ganglia and the cerebellum. Motor neurons are the only avenue that the central nervous system has for influencing the muscles of the body, and thus are also known as the final common pathway. The basic organization of the spinal cord is illustrated in this slide. Notice the spinal cord has a butterfly-like area shown in brown. This region should not be brown, but rather should be gray. Indeed, it is referred to as the gray matter because it is made up largely of the cell bodies of neurons, which give a gray appearance in unstained tissue. The butterfly-like area is surrounded by white matter, so called because the fiber tracts coming from higher brain regions and the sensory fiber tracts going up to the brain are located here. The fiber tracts are often heavily myelinated and thus present a white appearance. Let's follow the course of some basic inputs to the spinal cord. A sensory neuron that innervates the skin comes in as a sensory nerve at the top or dorsal surface of the spinal cord. The dorsal root ganglia, in which the cell bodies of the sensory neurons are located, is shown, as is the continuation of the sensory nerve into the top or dorsal horn of the butterfly-shaped gray area. Here, the sensory neuron makes a synaptic connection with an interneuron. Interneurons are small neurons whose axons remain completely within the spinal cord and never project outside of the cord. Interneurons can provide either excitatory or inhibitory innervation to their targets in the cord. This interneuron is innervating a motor neuron, which then sends its axon out through the lower or ventral horn to innervate a muscle. The white matter is the other major component of the spinal cord. The large white columns on the dorsal surface, indicated by the pointing finger, carries the fibers of the great sensory lemniscus to the thalamus. The more lateral region of the white matter contains both ascending sensory tracts and descending motor tracts, while the ventral white matter is composed mainly of descending motor pathways that will innervate spinal motor neurons, usually by first synapsing on interneurons. Some of the major inputs to the spinal cord come from sensory neurons in the periphery and form reflexes about which we are often unaware. I would like to give a very simple illustration of the variety of reflexes in the cord by considering the stretch reflex as shown on this slide. Here are the players in the circuit. The first is the flexor muscle that will be inhibited because it would cause the leg to lift. Next is the extensor muscle and the stretch receptor in the extensor that will be stimulated when the kneecap is stretched. So let's tap the kneecap and evoke the entire sequence of events. The action potential generated by the stretch receptor will travel up the sensory axon, past the dorsal root ganglia where its cell body is located, and extend into the spinal cord. There, the axon will bifurcate or break up into two branches. One branch will innervate the inhibitory interneuron, which in turn will inhibit the motor neuron to the flexor muscle. The other will make a direct excitatory connection with the motor neuron that innervates the extensor leg. The extensor muscle then contracts and lifts the leg, voila, the stretch reflex. But the inputs that evoke reflexes are only a small portion of the total input to the spinal cord. There are a wide variety of sensory receptors in the skin, some of which are shown here. Two other inputs are shown from the various receptors that monitor muscle length and joint position. These sensory receptors are called proprioreceptors and are activated by stimuli from within the body, such as degree of muscle stretch, muscle movement through receptors in the tendons, and joint position. Three types of proprioreceptors are shown. The first are the stretch receptors in the muscle spindles. The second are the Golgi tendon organs that measure muscle movement. And the third are receptors in the joints that measure the position of a limb. These influences, however, can be overridden by the strong influences of the descending pathways. For example, your stretch reflexes maintain the contraction of your leg muscles when you're standing, which is why you can stand for long periods without thinking about it. But if you decide to, you can lift your leg and walk, which basically is due to the action of descending tracts overriding spinal reflex activity. The cell bodies that give rise to descending motor pathways, or tracts, originate from nuclei, that is, cell groups, in the brainstem and from cells in the cortex. The brainstem is the portion of the brain that lies between the diencephalon and the spinal cord, that is, the medulla, pons, and midbrain, as indicated by the dashed lines in this slide. Several different cell groups in the brainstem give rise to important descending tracts. The names of most of these are not important for us, but I will mention two. The first is the corticospinal tract that originates in the motor portions of the cortex and projects directly to the motor neurons in the spinal cord, hence its name. The corticospinal tract is important for initiating and performing voluntary movements, especially fine voluntary movements. The second is the vestibulospinal tract that influences your muscles in response to changes in the position of your body, such as when you fall, or for any change in your posture. It helps maintain an upright and balanced posture by stimulating extensor motor neurons in the legs. There are two vestibulospinal tracts. The lateral vestibulospinal tract is the largest. But there is also a medial vestibulospinal tract. And that is only indicated here by the arrow. There are several others, such as the rubrospinal tract, so named because it originates from the red nucleus, and the tectospinal tract. The tectospinal tract derives its name from the tectum, which means the roof. In this case, the roof of the midbrain. Except for the vestibulospinal and corticospinal tracts, don't worry about the names of the others. I just want you to know there are many others besides those two. The massive innervation imparted by the descending pathways is shown, at least in part, in this slide. The large influence of the corticospinal tract on both motor neurons and interneurons is indicated, as are the influences of the other descending motor pathways. But these are not the only innervations the cord receives. Remember, there are a large number of inputs from the various cutaneous receptors in the skin and from the proprioreceptors in muscles, tendons, and joints. In short, the projections to the spinal cord are complex, and it should now be obvious why motor neurons are called the final common pathway.